This video aims to introduce us to Legitimation Code Theory, which may sound a bit daunting if you've never heard of it before. We'll refer to it as LCT for short. This video is the first in a series, each one taking one of LCT's explanatory frameworks. Now, all methodologies make ontological and epistemological assumptions, and the deeper philosophical work examining these should at some point be engaged with. However, in these introductory videos, we'll be concentrating on unpacking the methodology in its best light as a usable research strategy that you may want to appropriate after you've studied it. So we'll look at what LCT tries to do for us and cover such things as its translation device and learn about one of its explanatory frameworks that it calls specialization codes. Now, if all this sounds like gobbledygook, don't worry, that's only natural. But by the end, we hope, you'll see that quite a lot of LCT makes intuitive sense and its technical terminology won't feel so intimidating. LCT is a sociological approach to researching practices, especially in education, but any area involving knowledge practices. It's a methodology in the interpretivist paradigm, though it's flexible enough for mixed methods approaches. It consists of a number of explanatory frameworks, that is, frameworks to help us explain certain things. These could be thought of as conceptual toolkits. The LCT folk like to call them dimensions. Well, what do they do to explain? Basically, they each capture a different organising principle underlying a practice or a social context. Each dimension can be used as an analytical tool for revealing the rules of the game. Now, this idea is at the heart of LCT. Each practice has its rules of the game that define what is success. The LCT tools help us to make these rules, or rather a subset of them, explicit. A leading figure in its creation and development is Karl Matten, who wrote one of LCT's foundational books, Knowledge and Knowers, towards a realist sociology of education. Before we start unpacking LCT, and to help you make your decision as to whether this video is for you, here in a few slides is a condensed outline of its features. This approach is derived from and has been used to do research in fields and domains such as assessment, English for academic purposes, engineering, heritage, law, music education, nursing, political science, science teaching, social work, teacher preparation, and so on. LCT's approach to knowledge can be described as social realism, and Matten claims that this is derived from Roy Basker's critical realism, but with a narrower focus on, to quote, the properties of knowledge-producing fields of social practice and the structured principles and procedures developed in those fields that provide the basis for their legitimation. This idea of legitimation is obviously a big deal for LCT's approach. The essence of the purpose of this methodology is to explore the basis of achievement in a social practice. LCT is sensitive to what you might call the specificity of forms of knowledge. Critical thinking in sociology is not the same as critical thinking in chemistry, for example. Well, LCT's contribution is its set of tools for helping us make visible what these principles, rules, or whatever might be. So, how does LCT explain? Well, basically, by revealing the dynamic role and dimension of legitimating codes, or rules of the game, of a practice. In terms of analysis, and in a summary form, LCT does the following. We'll just state it here for you to read, but later on we'll unpack it with examples. In this video, we'll explain LCT's translation device, which is one of the core elements of its analytical approach. Okay, finally, in this sort of summary overview, an important thing always to consider before deciding whether to launch into studying any new methodology is, if I were to seriously consider LCT, where in my research journey should I seriously start looking into it? Well, we suggest either at the beginning, in the middle, or at the analytical phase. Since this methodology can be used abductively and following a thematic analysis, we think it might be useful at the middle or analytical phase. However, if you do indeed think LCT might have something, and remember there are lots of toolkits, we're only going to look at one in this video, we would encourage you to look at examples of LCT studies as early on in your research journey as you can. More on that later. So, have a think. If you are a researcher interested in learning a way to investigate knowledge practices in a particular field, understanding knowledge not as a socially neutral phenomena but as a real phenomena with characteristics that impact how it is built, developed and sustained, learning how to translate between theory and empirical data as part of doing analysis, well, maybe LCT might be worth looking at, even if you end up not using it. Okay, so we'll start. What is LCT? Well, we know the answer now, and it's simple. LCT is a framework for shaping and investigating social practices, basically. But what is it about practices that is important to this endeavour? Well, high on the list here might be that practices are structured and structuring. This is just a pithy way of saying that we're not just in them, we enact them. And this doesn't mean that they are simply the result of our actions. Here's the interesting thought. Practices are also a force in their own right and can influence and shape opportunities for further action. Well, two things follow from this that are important to LCT. We're not simply free to enact the practice in any way we wish, but nor is it the case that we don't have some freedom. In sum, we could say we're not determined by our practices, but neither are we completely free of them either. Another motivating insight behind LCT's development is that agents who participate in practices do not do so equally in terms of their power and influence. Now, this insight shows its historical connection to the left-leaning sociology of Basil Bernstein. We can't assume that everyone will have the same power and influence to change a particular practice, is the basic idea here. Hence, much research using LCT is committed to such things as epistemic justice and a more equitable access to knowledge building practices. We've already mentioned Roy Basker and critical realism, and for epistemology we could also mention Karl Popper's three worlds cosmology as another influence on LCT. But without going into detail about this here, LCT's concern with structured and structuring aspects of practices, should also be seen as an extended and critical elaboration of Pierre Bourdieu's field theory, and even more especially Basil Bernstein's code theory. A key concept in the LCT framework is languages of legitimation. Now, as Carl Maton is fond of reminding us, the big idea here is that there is always more to what we say and do than what we say and do. Practices have legitimating codes or rules of the game. And LCT, you could say, aims to help the researcher make sense of these rules of the game. That is, make sense of these languages of legitimation. Sometimes these are referred to as codes, legitimation codes, hence the name Legitimation Code Theory. Well, let's quickly have a look at this idea of codes. The phrase language code is a concept Bernstein used in his early work. He chose this deliberately to echo, we suspect, the concept of a genetic code. Now, roughly speaking, we could say that genes are a set of instructions that provide constraints and resources to what the organism is like, its appearance, how it survives, and how it behaves in its environment. And notice the wording here. Genes do not determine us, but they provide constraints and resources. So, by rough analogy, practices have not genes, but codes or rules of the game, or what LCT calls legitimation codes. You can read this. So every practice has a basis in a number of organising principles that legitimate or provide the rules of the game, that is, form the basis or DNA of the practice. Practices evolve. They can stagnate and die, or they can flourish. So understanding the legitimation codes can help us understand how change might be made possible, or what might be inhibiting change, or why there are situations where certain groups or subgroups don't seem to do well with or within the practice, whatever that might mean. In short, codes are taken to be part of the logic of reproduction. But what are these codes? Legitimating codes may take many forms, or as LCT folk like to call them, dimensions, within any social practice. This table presents the 3 most developed LCT dimensions to date, and there are others. Each of these dimensions, autonomy, semantics, and specialisation, constitutes a particular type of legitimacy structuring the dynamic at play in a knowledge practice. By at play, we mean that LCT recognises the relational complexity that goes on in a practice, both within a dimension and between dimensions. Now, I know all this sounds a bit abstract at the moment, but after we've got through some of these formal features, we'll unpack it through a concrete research example. Anyway, in the autonomy dimension, the legitimising source is here focused on how constituents of a practice are separated from other constituents within and outside the practice, and the dynamics of their play. For example, let's make it a bit more concrete. Let's imagine that a constituent could be a student's first language, or L1. And we might be interested to ask how we use a student's first language, L1, to teach them another language, L2. And if we should, how can we do this in a principled way? Or a constituent could be diverse knowledge practices, such as disciplinary knowledge, as opposed to workplace experience. And we might be interested to then ask, well, how such diverse knowledge practices are integrated within a program. In the semantics dimension, the legitimizing source is here focused on how knowledge shifts between abstract concepts and concrete examples. In specialised discourse, such as academic texts, we might wonder what differences to communication might there be in the patterns and dynamics between abstract concepts and concrete examples. Clearly, this dimension has a lot to offer pedagogical issues, such as how knowledge is transformed between relatively decontextualised condensed meanings as opposed to context-dependent simplified meanings, and how this transformation dynamic from one to the other and back again might offer a means of enabling cumulative knowledge building in classroom practice. Finally, the specialisation dimension is called this because the legitimizing source here is focused on the basis of what makes a knowledge practice unique or distinctive. Specialisation. What makes actors, discourses, and practices special or legitimate? This dimension focuses on how knowledge and knowing knowers, and they're not the same, right, are related in the way the practice legitimates itself. This last one will be unpacked by looking at a specific study that uses the specialisation dimension. As mentioned, we'll also explore an example of the analytical principle called a translation device to show how LCT deals with the theory-practice gap. The study we'll consider originated in a PhD thesis. The title was Knowledge and Knowers in Online Learning, Investigating the Effects of Online Learning on Student Sojourners by Associate Professor Rainbow Tsai Hung Chen, and apologies if I've not pronounced her name properly. Its focus is on the experiences of a group of Chinese students at an Australian university. So from the Australian perspective, the Chinese students would have been considered international students. Basically, the study wanted to examine the interplay between three contexts that may have influenced Chinese students' experiences of the Australian online program. The educational dispositions brought by the students from their home country, the educational practices characterising the educational context within which they were studying at the Australian university, and thirdly, students' resulting experiences with these educational practices. So we hope you can see that this is a piece of research that takes seriously the rules of the game, and so will involve exploring the legitimation codes that the Chinese students bring with them from their heritage culture, and also the legitimation codes of the online course at the Australian university, which can be conceptualised as the host culture, and what plays out given those codes when they have contact. Will there be a code clash, for instance? How will students' learning be impacted? And once all this has been analysed, what possibilities are there for the future? Here is what the researcher did in order to collect data. 3 focus groups with 16 Chinese students from across the course were put together to explore their educational dispositions. The aim was not to characterise Chinese education itself, but rather to explore these students' experiences and expectations of education. The study focused on students undertaking postgraduate online units in the Faculty of Education at the university. To characterise their educational context, 8 university teachers were interviewed about curriculum pedagogy and assessment on the units, and their study syllabuses or outlines were analysed. 7 Chinese students studying different online units were each interviewed through a semester an average of 4 times for a total of 41 hours in their native language, which happened to be Mandarin, about their experiences on the online units. The data sets would constitute what Chen understood as the 3 cultural dimensions that are playing a role in the students' experiences, namely heritage, host, and the contact between the two. Okay, so what you get from all this is, well, a lot of data. And you can see that Chen was interested in how the heritage culture of the students would interact with the host culture of the program when they came into contact with it over the course of the program. As mentioned, specialisation codes capture specifically a dimension of practices when they're conceived as knowledge knower structures. So this was the dimension that Chen uses. So we need to understand a little bit about how this specialisation dimension works. Basically, these are codes that are based on the idea that every practice is about or orientated towards something by someone. So analytically, we can distinguish between what the practices are about, their object if you like, and how they are orientated towards this, and how they are oriented towards who or what is enacting the practice. The former are called epistemic relations. That's the phrase that LCT uses. And the latter are called social relations. So it's very important to get clear in your minds the difference between these two. Each of the two relations, epistemic relations and social relations, may be strongly or weakly emphasized, and the two strengths together generate the specialization codes. So you can have strong epistemic relations, weak epistemic relations, strong social relations, weak social relations. LCT's specialization domain formally defines each of these relative strengths as follows. When an epistemic relation is strong in a practice, it's because it is in possession of specialized knowledge, principles or procedures concerning specific objects of study. That's emphasized as the basis of achievement. Now, notice that this definition of strong epistemic relations is pretty abstract. It doesn't even hint at what might count as the specialized knowledge or what the specific objects of study might be. That's because we're here concerned with laying out the theoretical, that is, the non-empirical language side of the analysis. This will be the case for all the code definitions. Here's the next one. When an epistemic relation is weak in a practice, it's because specialized knowledge, principles or procedures concerning specific objects is downplayed. When a social relation is strong in a practice, it's because the attributes of actors are emphasized as measures of achievement. And when a social relation is weak in a practice, it's because the attributes of actors are downplayed. These strengths and weaknesses can be visualised on what the LCT folk call a specialisation plane. That's a topological space of infinite positions based on the four principal modalities that comprise the specialisation code. The strong to weak epistemic relations, look at the vertical axis, and the strong to weak social relations, the horizontal axis. The four codes, here they are, correspond to the four quadrants. So we've got a knowledge code, top left there, where ER, or epistemic relation, is strong, and SR, social relation, is weak. So we could say legitimacy here amounts to it's what you know, not who you are. That's important. To illustrate that with something more concrete, think of a typical way we might think of the field of hard science. Basically, what do you need to be successful in hard science? Well, you need knowledge. Your politics, your dispositions, not so important. A knower code, that would be bottom right, where ER is weak but SR is strong. Here we could say legitimacy amounts to it's who or what you are that counts. Again, let's come up with a concrete example. Think of a context where it's important to have natural talent or good cultivated taste or embodying a certain identity, as in feminist standpoint theory. And then finally, well, no, not finally, but the third one is an elite code, where both epistemic relations and social relations are strong, hence elite. Legitimacy here amounts to being knowledgeable and talented, let's say. Think of a professional classical musician, a field where, at an advanced level at any rate, there is a need for music theory, but also there's a need for having the right kinds of sensibilities. And then the last one, of course, is a relativist code, where both social relations and epistemic relations are weak, and basically here legitimacy is anything goes. Okay. So back to the study. Now, you'll recall that there were three foci. Here they are. The educational dispositions brought by students, the educational practices characterising the context within which they were studying, and the students' experiences of and with the Australian programme. Well, following a theory of Bernstein's that seemed useful to the researcher, who was Chen, it was thought to be helpful for each factor to be analysed in terms of its construal of what Bernstein called the three message systems of curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. Thus the study analysed an array of different issues involving diverse objects. This sounds great, but how can all these be related to each other? To research human practices requires being clear as to how specific concepts are empirically realised within each object of study. For example, the empirical forms taken by strong epistemic relations in student interviews may be different to those taken by strong epistemic relations in teaching materials, and may appear differently in those materials in terms of its curriculum, forms of pedagogy and assessment practices. So what is needed here is a translation device. That is, something that makes explicit what the empirical realisation of the code concept is within each specific phenomenon. So here is most of the translation device that was developed by Chen specifically for the purpose of her research study. Down the left side you'll see that the three foci of the study are listed: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. The table on the left is for the epistemic relations, and the one on the right is for the social relations. Well, let's have a look at this in a bit more detail, and then we'll do an activity. When epistemic relations are strong in the area of curriculum, manifested as content knowledge, the translation device defines strong epistemic relation for this area in the following way. Content knowledge is emphasized as determining the form of legitimate knowledge. This is what the researcher developed as the indicator for strong epistemic relations in the area of curriculum. The indicator for weak epistemic relations in the area of curriculum was defined as this. Content knowledge is downplayed as less important in defining legitimate educational knowledge. In the area of pedagogy, manifested in the teaching of content knowledge, strong epistemic relations were defined as procedures for learning content knowledge are explicit to learners and emphasized in determining the form of pedagogy. Let's look at another example. In the area of assessment, strong epistemic relations were defined as making explicit evaluative criteria. And of course, indicators were defined for the social relations as well. Okay, back to the top. Of course, what we're seeing in these indicators is the finished product, as it were, and not the process for defining them. And that's too bad, of course, because this is really a critical part of the craft of doing this kind of research. What we can say, though, is that, not surprisingly, this was a non-linear, protractive and interpretive process, similar to the sort of inductive processes necessary for any kind of thematic analysis that uses qualitative data. And it involved all this that I'll put up on the screen for you to read. And I'm just going to let you read it. Unfortunately, in this video, we won't have time to unpack it with actual examples, but please note that there will be a reference in the resources that will include a paper written by Chen and Matten on how translation devices are developed. So hopefully you'll go back to exploring this in a different way. Okay. There is one thing, though, to point out that might be helpful and that we do have time for. At some point during the process of constructing the indicators for the relative strengths of codes, selected codes from the data illustrating each indicator were also entered into the table. For example, in the area of curriculum content knowledge, this illustration of strong epistemic relations was chosen. So this is a quote from the data, so a selection from the data. The information in the textbook decided by the teacher was what a study unit was all about. So that's a student's a quote from a student. And here's one chosen for weaker epistemic relations. We show them digital repositories that they need to go to in order to access those readings that are relevant to their context. That, to me, that sounds like a quote from one of the Australian lecturers. These sample quotes are useful in indicating how the researcher is interpreting the indicators as translators for the relative strength of an epistemic or social relation. And when you consider that there will be one of these for each code, it's a good way for making transparent the consistency and coherence of the translation device indicators. Another thing to note is that the process of developing the indicators is likely to be helped by iteratively reading theory to data and data to theory, going in two directions. We have the theoretical or internal language of the code on the left, the indicator that translates this into its empirical realization, and on the right the actual empirical realization or a sample of it. At least that's one way of reading it, where the question is, what realizes this code? But it can also go the other way, where it's asked, in code terms, what is this piece of data an instance of? So let's pause the video in a moment and do an activity to get us to look more carefully at this particular translation device. To do this, please upload the translation device activity handout. It's a handout with one side focusing on epistemic relations and the other side focusing on social relations. And the idea is to have a go at fitting the example quotes from the studies, fitting the example quotes from the study's actual data into the relevant epistemic relations on the one sheet and social relations on the other sheet of the handout. And the first one has been done for you. When you've completed it, come back to the video to see the answer key and what the study found when it was completed. That is, when the study was completed. So, see you in about 10 minutes. Please pause the video now and come back. So here is the translation device activity answer key. The numbered data samples are in red for epistemic relations and green, or blue actually, for social relations. Let's do a quick review of the study in order to make clear a very important distinction in this kind of research design. The study involved a very useful organising framework. What is this? Basically, the study was organised around wanting to capture the educational dispositions brought by students, or the heritage culture dimension of the cultural context. Also, it wanted to capture the educational practices characterising the educational context within which the students studied, or the host culture. Well, that came from the host culture. And also it wanted to capture students' resulting experiences with these educational practices, or the contact dimension of the cultural context. But not only this, the study was also organised around, apparently inspired by Bernstein, how these cultural contexts construed curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. So for each of these cultural dimensions, data was collected for looking at how curriculum was construed, how pedagogy was construed, and how assessment was construed. The reasons for going over all this is to point out that an organising framework is really important for a study like this, but to also point out that it's not enough. We also need an analytic framework, because an organising framework only provides a source of what to analyse, but not the conceptual means for doing it. But an analytic framework provides the conceptual means for analysing the organising principles of a practice, hopefully. So here is Chen and Maton commenting on this point. They write, descriptive data analysis, notice, such as, quote, Chinese education values learning a large amount of content knowledge, unquote. Or that, quote, Australian online courses emphasise learners deciding which part of the content is important to them, unquote. These might be true and helpful descriptions, but do not by themselves allow systematic comparison. But by analysing the organising principles of dispositions, practices and contexts across the heritage culture, the host culture and contact outcomes, we might start to see similarities, variations and differences among them. In other words, descriptive analysis only describes the realisations of the organising principles, but not the principles themselves. So, the claim with doing this kind of research is that specialisation codes provide a way to go beyond empirical description and capture the organising principles. An organising principle belongs to the language of theory. It's non-empirical, but it allows for very diverse kinds of empirically available phenomena to be compared. To sum up, we hope you can see that this study capitalises on the idea that actors' practices, whether they be teachers or students, as they happen to be in this particular piece of research, embody messages concerning what should be the dominant measurement of achievement, what LCT calls the languages of legitimation. Using specialisation codes to capture that dimension of practice when they are conceived as knowledge knower structures and involving a translation device for translating the relative strengths of epistemic relations and social relations helped us see what the legitimating codes were and how they were distributed amongst the meaning and value of curriculum, its assumptions concerning content knowledge and the role of human experience, the meaning and value of pedagogy involved with content knowledge and the personal dimensions of learning, and the meaning and value of assessment, the use of explicit criteria or self-evaluation. The study analysed not Chinese education, but how the particular participants of this specific study described their own experiences and expectations of education, with the aim of revealing the educational dispositions these students brought to the Australian university context. Here's a quote from the Chinese student data, commenting on the meaning of learning in a Chinese context. We'll let you read it. The researcher commented that the students felt the learning of content knowledge was emphasised in this explicit curriculum. Anything beyond the boundary of a study unit, such as other forms of educational knowledge and one's everyday practice, was not considered relevant to the learning of the particular subject content. Similar things were found for all the foci areas. The data showed that from the Chinese students' perspective, curriculum emphasises content knowledge and downplays personal knowledge. Pedagogy emphasises procedures for delivering teachers' expert knowledge about subject content and downplays personal dimensions of learning. And assessment comes with explicit criteria for evaluating learners' states of knowledge and downplays personal measures of achievement. In code terms, the students were operating with strong epistemic relations and weak social relations. And this, of course, can be captured on the topological chart like this. Having strong epistemic relations and weak social relations means it's a knowledge code. In contrast, teaching practices in the online unit look like this. Because curriculum downplayed content knowledge and emphasised personal experience. Pedagogy downplayed teachers delivering subject content or structuring student learning and emphasised the need for self-regulating learners to create their own understandings. And assessment avoided explicit evaluative criteria and emphasised knowers evaluating themselves based on their own criteria. Here is part of the conclusion that Chen and Maton reached regarding this result. Here's part of the conclusion to the study anyway. So please read this. The LCT study revealed a code clash here. The constructivist pedagogy, curriculum design and assessment tended towards enacting a knower code. Yet this was experienced, at least by the Chinese students, as a relativist code. This was a problem, as the particular kind of knower code underpinning the teaching practices was, in this case, rendered invisible. Whatever might be said about constructivist approaches, and LCT would not assume that there can only be one form of what constructivist approaches are, effectively making it an invisible pedagogy, as it was in this case, is itself a little bit problematic. However, once this has been analysed sufficiently, it's potentially a fixable problem, requiring perhaps, amongst other things, a better fit between the programme's rhetoric about itself and what in reality it's up to. For example, teachers could make explicit the knower code underpinning their teaching and thus make visible the rules of the game, as well as provide support in engaging with the learning environments in the knower code way that they expect, such as through modelling. Unfortunately, as the authors also point out, the constructivist beliefs of the teachers ruled out making these ideas visible or providing explicit guidance, at least prior to the results of the study. Yet LCT shows how important and possible it is to make the rules of the game visible. We'd like to close now with some concluding remarks about LCT. We'd like to leave you with some thoughts about what might motivate researchers to use LCT generally and specialisation codes in particular, since that's the theme of this video. Here's a rather simplified and basic argument. A key concern among researchers using legitimation code theory in educational contexts is that teaching, learning and assessment are often guided by what is immediately visible or tangible. The deeper causes, though, of student success or failure can too often remain hidden and under-examined. And this can lead to a limited ability to systematically research learning processes and a drift towards a theoretical surface-level pedagogy or other supposed solutions, especially if there is a weak understanding of how knowledge practices differ across disciplines. So for these researchers, LCT offers, analytical tools, legitimation domains, to move beyond surface appearances, to better help us analyse structures and structuring. This would promise to reveal both expected and unexpected influences on learning, for example. And hopefully all this might contribute to broadening student access to disciplinary discourses, knowledge and ways of knowing. With this basic argument in mind, research projects have been carried out using LCT tools. Reference to many of those studies within various field domains will be found in the resources. So do check them out, because that's the best way of kind of getting a sense of what you can do with this methodology, this basic toolkit. Okay, this is our last slide Phew. We hope you found this introductory video to LCT useful for your own research design work. In time, the other two major dimensions will each get their own video. As mentioned, for those who have access to the resources, an annotated list of useful examples of each of the dimensions will be referenced. Also, a blog space will be created for uploading your questions, comments, and opportunities to get connected with others who are using the methodology or at least thinking of it. The Chen and Matten study is only one out of hundreds, if not thousands actually, of studies using one or more of LCT's code dimensions. As mentioned, Matten's rather dense Knowledge and Knowers is a key founding text, and a new book, Sociology of Possibility, that he's authored, is to be published in the summer of 2026. There are many other book collections of LCT works as well as thousands of journal articles. Also, there are LCT interest groups scattered around the world, and an LCT website full of useful resources. So, thank you for watching, and best of luck with your research journeys.